I came home from school one day to find a strange man in the kitchen. He was making something on the stove, peering intently into a saucepan. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" I asked him. "It was a week since my father died." The man said, "Shh, not now, just a minute." He had a strong foreign accent. I recognized that he was concentrating, and said, "What's that you are making?" This time he glanced at me. "Polenta," he said. I went over to the stove and looked inside the saucepan. The stuff was yellowy, sticky, a thick semolina. "That looks disgusting," I told him, and then went in search of my mother. I found her in the garden. "Mom, there is a man in the kitchen. He's cooking. He says he's making polenta." "Yes, darling." "Polenta?" said my mother. I began to suspect she might not be much help. I wished my father were here. "I'm not exactly sure what that is," my mother said vaguely. "Mom, I don't care about polenta. Who is he? What's he doing in our kitchen?" "Ah!" exclaimed my mother. She was wearing a thin flowery summer dress, and I noticed suddenly how thin she was. My mother, I thought. Everything seemed to pile on top of me, and I found myself unexpectedly crying. "Don't cry, love," said my mother. "It's all right. He's our new lodger." She hugged me. I wiped my eyes, sniffling. "Lodger?" "With your father gone," my mother explained, "I'm afraid I'm having to free one of the spare rooms." She turned and began to walk back toward the house. We could see the lodger moving about. Put my hand on my mother's arm to stop her going inside. "Is he living here then?" I asked. "With us? I mean, will he eat with us and for?" "This is his home now," said my mother. "We must make him feel at home," she added, as if it were an afterthought. "His name's Constantine. He's Russian." Then she went inside. I paused to take this information. A Russian. This sounded exotic and interesting, and made me inclined to forgive his rudeness. I watched my mother enter the kitchen. Constantine, the Russian, looked up, and a smile lighted up his face. "Malia!" He opened his arms, and she went up to him. They kissed on both cheeks. My mother looked around and beckoned to me. "This is my daughter," she said. There was a note in her voice that I couldn't identify. She stretched out her hand to me. "Ah, you must be Anna," the Russian said. I was startled, not expecting him to have my name so readily on his lips. I looked at my mother. She was giving nothing away. The Russian held out his hands and said, "Constantine, I am very pleased to meet you. I have heard so much about you." We shook hands. I wanted to know how he had heard so much about me, but couldn't think of a way of asking, at least not with my mother there. The Russian turned back to his cooking. He seemed familiar with our kitchen. He sprinkled salt and pepper over the top of the mass of semolina-like substance, and then carried it through to the living room. For some reason, my mother and I followed him. We all sat in armchairs and looked at one another. I thought I was the only one who felt any sense of night. When I got home late next evening, Constantine and my mother were deep in conversation over dinner. There were candles on the table. What's going on? I asked. I'm hungry, darling, said my mother. We've left you some. It's in the kitchen. I was starving. No thanks, I said silently. I'm fine. Though it was early, I went upstairs to bed. Later, I heard my mother's footsteps on the stairs. She came into my room and leaned over me. I kept my eyes closed and breathed deeply. Anna, she said. Anna, are you awake? I remained silent. I know you are awake, she said. There was a pause. I was on the point of giving in when she spoke again. She said, Your father never loved me. You should not have had to know this. He did not love me. She spoke each word with a terrible clarity, as if trying to burn it into my brain. I squeezed my eyes tight. Rigid in my bed, I waited for my mother to leave the room, wondering if I would get 11 all this with time. はい。この最後の1ページに当たるところね、これがエンディングに当たりますね。で、ここが大事ですけど、はい。もう一度確認してみましょう。When I got home late next evening, 次の晩、遅く私が家に帰ると、Constantine and my mother were deep in conversation over dinner. コンスタンティンと母が会話にもう熱中してたと。会話の深くにいたっていうのはね。会話に熱中してたわけですね。over dinner. ディナーを食べながら。There were candles on the table. テーブルにはキャンドルがあるんですね。What's going on? I asked. まあ直訳すれば何が進んでるのって言ってるわけですけど、一体何っていう感じですよね。Are you hungry, darling? お腹空いてる ?said my mother. まあ、darling っていうのはね、親子だったりするともうほとんど意味はないですよね。We've left you some. あなたに取っといてあるわよ。It's in the kitchen. キッチンにある。I was starving. これも直訳すれば飢えていた。まあ、飢えかけていたですね。進行形ですからね。で、starve は実は飢えて死ぬって意味なんで、もう飢えて死にかけていたって言ってますから、まあ、お腹ペコペコだった。No thanks. いらない。I said silently. silently なんていう単語は普通ももちろん知らないんですけど、まあ、ここはだから流せばいいです。I'm fine. 大丈夫。Though it was early, I went upstairs to bed. まだ早かったけれども、私は2階に上がって、もう寝たっていうかね。ベッドに行ったって、この場合はこのベッドが深さんですから、もう寝たっていうんですね。Later, I heard my mother's footsteps on the stairs. しばらくして、そのお母さんの足音が、その階段で鳴るのを耳にしたわけですね。足音がした。She came into my room and leaned over me. 私の部屋に入ってきて、leaned っていうのは、lean っていう、もたれかかるっていう単語の過去形です。でもたれかかったんだけど、over me ですから、おそらく彼女が、入り口の方に背を向けて寝てるから、まあ、寝たふりしてるわけだけど、で、それを顔を覗き込むために、覆いかぶさる感じね。オーバーミーして、自分のことを超えて顔を覗き込むようにして、もたれかかったってことですね。I kept my eyes closed and breathed deeply. 目を閉じて、で深く息をした。まあ、要するに寝たふりをしたわけですね。Anna, she said. Anna, are you awake? アナ、起きてるの ?I remained silent. それでも黙ってた。I know you are awake, she said. 起きてるのは分かってるのよ。There was a pause. 沈黙があったわけですね。I was on the point of giving in when she spoke again. 10番、ちょっともうね、問題になってますけど、 on the top of っていう、何々仕掛けていたっていう意味ですよね。give in 仕掛けてた。when そしたら she spoke again。母がまた話し始めた。she said, your father never loved me。父さんは never だから一度も私を愛さなかった。You should not have had to know this。これ難しいですね。should not have pp。しなければよかったのにっていう should not have pp。で、そこに have to 入ってます。had to がね。しなければならなかったが入ってるので、しなければならなかったを否定すると、する必要がないになりますよね。で、それが should not have pp なんで、する必要はなかったのだが、ですよね。You should not have had to know this。このことを知る必要はなかったのだけど、He did not love me。お父さんは私を愛してなかった。She spoke each word with a terrible clarity。母は一言一言をひどく明瞭に、clarity、明瞭に言った。As if trying to burn it into my brain。as if ですね、まるでです。で、いきなり ing ですけど、これは代名詞の主格プラス B 動詞の省略ですね。だから、するかのようにとなんですけど、その一言一言を私の脳に焼き付けるかのように。burn it into my brain。I squeeze my eyes tight。squeeze は絞るって意味ですけど、目を絞るってことは、目をギュッと閉じたっていう。タイトもついてますね。きつくって言ってます。目をギュッと閉じた。rigid in my bed。rigid ってこれ形容詞ですけど、動かない。みんなが知ってる単語としては多分厳しいっていう単語なんですけど、これじっとしてて動かないことも表しますね。だから、ベッドで動かずに、I waited for my mother to leave the room。母が部屋を出ていくのを待った。Wondering if I would get 11 all this with time。もう時とともにこれを何々できるのかなと思いながら。ちょっとね、10番、11番って穴も開いてるわけ、下線部があったり、空所が開いてたりとかするわけですけど、このお母さんの告白ね、決定的なね、そのお父さんが自分のことを愛してなかったんだっていう、お父さんもう亡くなってていないから真実はわからないわけですけど、本当のところはね。少なくともお母さんはそう思ってた。お父さんは自分のことを愛していないとお母さんが思ってたっていうことがここで、明らかになるわけですよね。これがこの話のオチの部分というかエンディングの部分ですから、これを踏まえて、これから読み直しながら解いていくということになるわけです。じゃあ行きましょう。最初のところは問題ないんで、さっといきますね。I came home from school one day to find a strange man in the kitchen. He was making something on the stove, peering intently into a saucepan. Who are you? What are you doing here? I asked him. It was a week since my father died. Then the man said, Shh, not now, just a minute. He had a strong foreign accent. I recognized that he was concentrating and said, What that you're making? Next time he glanced at me. Planter, he said. I went over to the stove and looked inside the saucepan. The stove was yellowy, sticky, a thick semolina. That looks disgusting, I told him, and then went in search of my mother. 初めて読んだ時と、こうやって一回最後まで読んで、かつ最後を理解して読み返した時とで、見えてくる風景が違うっていうか、随分場面が割と鮮明にというかね、一回目に比べると鮮明にわかるなっていう印象じゃないかなと思うんですけどね。もちろんだからといって問われてはいないんで、流せばいいんですけど、流した感じが違うんじゃないかと思いますね。これが小説とかを2回読む時の面白さっていうか、なんですよね。